Marta Osterhout came out to a broad, wind-scoured prairie valley where every sensible soul broke the ground for soft spring wheat and hauled it green gold to the railroad each fall, and she put her whole cheap claim into the one notion that country swore was a fool's waste of a windy rise, a mill turned by nothing but the everlasting prairie wind and a great tight granary beside it. To grind and hold the valley's own bread out of a hard old country wheat the settled folk would not so much as feed their teams, and the people of Harrow Bend took one look at a young, unmarried woman raising a windmill where there was no stream to turn a wheel, sowing a coarse dark grain where every neighbor sowed the fine soft kind, and holding back her seed when every neighbor sold his down to the last peck for cash, and decided before her first sheaf was cut that she would have a leaning fool's tower and a crib of musty ruin and a spoiled name by the harvest, for everyone knew a slip of a girl could not raise a true mill without a man over her, nor make good bread out of cattle wheat, nor keep a granary sound through a wet prairie year. She did not know yet that before a whispered lie and a grain buyer's book could take her ground, and her father's old craft together from her, the quietest man in that whole valley, a Wright who had scarcely said a dozen words to her, would set his own 2 hands and his own long season against the whole district to make her mill turn and her grain keep, and to keep her. It had begun with a long grief and a longer road, and a keepsake carried 1,000 miles. Marta was born of an old milling people, in a Green River country across the water where a family measured its worth not in the acres it owned, but in the grain it could grind true, and the bread it could keep sound through a hungry winter. Her father had been the finest miller on that river, a patient man who could tell by the smell of a handful and the grind of a stone the very hour a wheat was fit to mill. He was gone the winter a great combine of roller mills and railroads bought up the water power and put the little stone millers off the race for good, and Marta came west with the last of nothing, only the knowledge in her 2 hands. A sack of the hard old country winter wheat her people had carried and kept for 3 generations, and her mother's hand-quern wrapped in a woven cloth, its 2 round stones worn hollow and smooth by the daily bread of 100 years and more. She took up a cheap quarter section no wheat man would trouble to bid on, a high windy rise above the valley that caught the everlasting prairie wind and grew nothing anyone wanted, and there she meant to raise a mill the wind would turn. The men who ran that valley did not trouble to hide what they thought of a girl and her windmill notion. Orville Gantry, who bought the valley's grain at his warehouse by the railroad and carried half the district on his book besides, told her plainly that a wind-turned mill was an old country fancy no sensible plainsman would sink $1 in, that there was no bread in a coarse dark wheat a body could not sell, and that when her fool's tower leaned over in the first hard blow, he would carry her on. The book, so long as that rise of hers, was good security and not 1 week past. And Elmira Doane, who set the moral weather among the settled wives, let it be known that a young woman climbing about a mill frame in the wind with her sleeves rolled was not what a rising valley meant to have in it, and that the Christian kindness was to talk the poor creature into a tidy kitchen and a husband before she starved. The pity in it was the settled, comfortable kind, and it had teeth. She would haul her load of the hard wheat past whole families at their soft wheat harvest and hear them chuckling among themselves in amused disbelief, and she did not once let it into her face. Here is the thing the valley had not troubled to learn. Marta had been raised in the mill the way other girls are raised in a kitchen garden, and she knew what not one soft wheat man on that flat had ever thought to know, that a hard old country winter wheat sown in the fall and rooted deep through the cold comes ripe and is cut in the early summer, weeks before the high heat, and stands drought and hail and hard luck that would flatten the tender spring kind, that it grinds to a dense dark meal, that makes a close-keeping bread a family can live on when the fine white flour is long gone, and that grain, held back in a tight, dry crib and ground at home, is a valley's own bread and its own next seed. Worth more in a bad year than all the cash a man can get for it in a good one. And she kept one thing above all her trade dear to her, her mother's hand quern, its stones worn smooth by 100 years of a family's bread, and she meant, the first evening she set it on the sill of her half-built mill, that the old careful craft it stood for would not die out of her family on a soft wheat man's say-so while she had 2 hands to work it with. And none of her care would save her ground, for the valley ran on credit, and the credit ran through Orville Gantry. A district mortgaged to the one soft crop rose or fell by the soft wheat, and Gantry, who lent against next year's harvest and took the land when the harvest failed, had grown broad and easy buying out the ruined at his own price, and had a particular eye for that high windy rise. Worth 3 of any low quarter to a man who could see a mill on it that the whole valley would have to bring its grain to. So when Marta let it be known she would raise a mill the wind would turn and grind good bread cheap for any neighbor, and hold the valley seed safe besides, a word began to go round ahead of her, low and certain and ruinous, that her hard old country wheat was poor, coarse, weevily stuff, fit for no Christian table, that would breed sickness in the bread, and that the grain she cribbed on that damp rise would go musty and mold and be a whole valley's shame. It cost the men who passed it nothing, and it meant to cost her everything. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is saved by luck or by a fortune fallen out of the sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever hard season they have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then draw your chair up close and stay with me. Because Marta is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a county is quickest to write off are so often the very ones with the most quiet worth in them, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person whole when the whole country has already made up its mind not to. The man who put the sharpest edge on that word did not grind a peck of grain himself. Leland Coyle was the agent for a big milling company down at the railroad, a smooth, plausible fellow who freighted the company's barreled flour and shipped grain up the line at the company's price, and stood to lose a tidy thing if the valley ever learned it could grind its own bread on a windy rise for a fraction of it. He did not come at Marta with a threat, but with a sorrowful reasonableness that was worse, driving out one bright afternoon, hat against his chest, to tell her that no one doubted she meant well, but that a coarse old country wheat ground on a homemade stone was a chancy. Unwholesome business sure to sicken somebody and shame her, and that if she would only counsel her neighbors to buy the company's clean, tested flour like sensible people, he would see her spared the ruin he could so plainly see coming. He let that word unwholesome sit gently in the air, tipped his fine hat, and drove off, and behind his smoothness ran Gantry's book debt and the whisper both. And it ran through the valley like fire in dry grass. It was tidy work. No one had to say the girl had failed, only that her bread would sicken and her grain would mold, and by the fall settling she would be starved off her rise. It would go on Gantry's book at Gantry's price, and the hand quern would go back into its cloth. The silent soul who would see her whole through all of it had been watching longer than she knew. Cyrus Holt was the right of that country, the closest-mouthed man ever to true a timber or hang a stone, a lean, weather-browned man in his middle 30s with careful, scarred hands, who kept the little mill and wagon shop down where the road crossed the creek and raised the frame and the wheel and the stone for every mill and barn on the flat. and asked so little company that folk took his long silences for sourness. He had come up hard himself, orphaned young and bound out to a hard master, gentled once by an old master right who took a starving, bound out stranger and off the road, one black winter, and taught him the craft and the worth of clean, true, honest work. And he had never after been able to abide a cruelty done to a lone soul who only wanted to work. It was Cyrus who had heard the whisper against Marta at the warehouse and said nothing, and gone home to his cold shop and lain awake. But Cyrus Holt had eyes, and what they told him, from the first day he watched her set her mother's worn stones on the sill and grind out a handful of the hard wheat by her own hand to show it made a good, dark meal, was that the girl the valley had written off was no fool, but knew a truth about that dry country the soft wheat men were too proud to hear. And Cyrus knew a thing about grain that not one soul on the flat but he and she had ever troubled to learn, that the ruin of good grain is damp and vermin, that wheat cribbed green or held in a leaky, ill-built granary will heat and mold and weevil to a sour waste, and that only grain kept in a tight, dry, close-built crib and ground true on a well-dressed pair of stones will keep a year sweet. And mill to honest bread. And he began, lying awake in his loft over the shop with the creek talking under the ice, to think what a man who kept a Wright's bench and his own hoarded timber and no one to answer to might quietly do about a season and a woman's grain, and tell no living soul. He said his piece to her on a cold, bright evening in the fall, when the whisper had got well about, and she stood straight and white by her half-raised mill, pretending she had not heard it. He stood at the edge of her mill yard with his hat turning slow in his big scarred hands, and said the longest thing he had said to a living soul in years. A windmill wanted a true framed tower and a sound wheel, and a well-dressed pair of stones to grind fine and not scorch the meal, and a granary wanted a tight, dry, close-cribbed house to hold the grain sweet, and there was no one nearer than the railroad who could raise and hang it true. And he could. If she would grind her own grain and keep her own book and her own good name, he would frame her the mill and hang the stones and crib her the granary against the harvest, and she need pay him nothing but the leave to do it. He made the whole of it to the brim of his hat, for he could not have made it any other way. Marta did not thank him prettily. A girl alone had reason to be wary of a man's easy kindness. But she lay awake that night and understood at last what he had truly held out to her, not charity and not himself, but only that the grain would be ground clean and kept sound, the very thing Gantry and Coyle had set out to take from her, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, as a plain matter of good work owed to good work. In the morning she told him she would grind her own grain and keep her own book and stand her own reckoning, and owe him nothing but thanks. And the corner of his mouth moved, which, on Cyrus Holt, was very near a smile. There was nowhere much for the two of them to be but at the work, and a shared labor has a way of leaking into the heart whether two people will it or not. All that hard bright fall his wagon came up the rise, and every evening when her chores were done she worked beside him, holding the great timbers steady while he pinned them, and turning the grindstone while he trued its face. When the tower stood plumb, and the wind first caught the sails, and the stones came round with a low, sweet rumble, and threw a first dust of good meal into the trough. They stood back from it together in the cold blue dusk, and neither of them said a word, and both stood a moment too long, looking at the plain good thing they had made. He never once said that he had begun to time his day by the little light in her mill window up on the rise, and she never once said she had begun to listen of an evening for the knock of his adze to fall silent down the creek, and neither of them said one word about the thing that was slowly happening. If you've made it this far into Marta's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The truest proving of it came with the turning year. She had sown her hard old country wheat on the fall winds, and it rooted deep and lay green under the snow while the valley's ground lay bare, and it stood up thick and early in the first real heat and came ripe to the sickle weeks before a soft wheat field had headed out. Marta cut it and bound it and threshed it clean, and Cyrus's windmill ground it fine and sweet, and his tight granary held it bin on bin, dry and cool and close, till the mocked little mill on the rise stood full to the plates with a year's bread and a valley's worth of seed, and not a weevil nor a musty handful in the whole of it. And through all that damp green season her cribbed grain kept sound and sweet and bone-dry, bin after bin, where the whole valley had promised her a crib of musty ruin. And she laid it to the good tight cribbing and her own careful keeping, and was thankful, and did not once think to ask why a Wright's plain spare bins should be the driest, closest-built granary in the whole country. She warmed him at her stove after the long hauling days, and did not make a fuss of it, for she had learned he did not want a fuss made, but she had never in her life felt so plainly stood by, and the talk between them came slow, and then easier. She found he was not silent for having nothing to say, but for too many years with no one worth the saying of it to. And she told him things she had told no one, and both felt the change and were half afraid of it, for a thing begun to save a trade had no business taking root in the heart. It was the old freighter who let the truth slip, and Obadiah Loomis who let it. When the wheat was in, and Marta walked down the valley road one bright morning to settle with old Obie Loomis for the timber and the stone he had carted to her rise, the old man, who had freighted oak and burr stone up and down that valley all the long season and feared no man's opinion, squinted at her over his pipe and said, not knowing he was telling her a single thing, that she owed the keep of that grain to more than her own careful hand, for there had not been one night all that long fall and winter that he had not carted seasoned timber and dressed stone to Cyrus Holt's shop and found the Wright's lamp burning long past the middle of the night, turning away the railroad's paying orders to true and pin and dress bin after tight bin and stone after stone for. Her mill laying up far more granary and grinding than a woman's little rise could ever fill, all off the best seasoned oak and the fine hard burr stone Holt had hoarded 3 years for his own mill. And it beat him clean, the old man said, why a Wright with paying work at his elbow would burn his whole season's rest and his finest wood and stone making granary bins for a woman and take next to nothing for them, unless it was for something a man could not rightly put a name to. And then he saw Marta's face, and shut his mouth 2 words too late. Marta walked back up the valley road with her ears ringing and understood the whole of it at last. The quiet man had not merely framed her mill and cribbed her granary, he had spent the whole long season at his own bench, long past midnight, making the very bins and dressing the very stones that would let her grain keep bone dry and grind to honest bread and prove Coyle's poor wheat. Won't keep lie a lie on its own worth, and he had never said a word of it, passing off hours of his best work as plain spare stock, meaning her sound grain and her good bread to answer for her so she would never once feel bought or beholden. Marta, who had been taught too young to ask a thing of anybody, felt something she had shut away since the old river country come loose in her chest. That evening, when his adze fell silent down the creek and his wagon came up the rise, she did not hand him a timber to steady. She took down her mother's hand-quern instead, the humble stone of the craft his season had kept alive, and set it in his big scarred hands and closed his fingers over it, and did not let go, and he looked down at her hands on his, and then up at her face, and did not say one word, and everything was said. But the poor wheat talk was still abroad, and Marta found she was not content to let it stand. The grain would keep whatever the valley thought, but the plain honest goodness of her bread, and her father's way of grinding a sweet true meal, she meant to prove herself, in the open, before the very people who had judged her. So she sent word up and down the valley that on a set day she would throw open her mill and her granary to any soul who cared to come and see and judge the grain and the bread for himself. The summer came on and made her case for her before ever she opened the door. Out of a brassy sky one still July afternoon, the grasshoppers came. A shimmering gray cloud that put out the sun and settled roaring on the whole green valley, and in a day and a night they ate it to the ground. The soft spring wheat standing green and lush, and 3 weeks from the sickle, the corn, the garden truck, the very leaves off the trees, and rose, and went on, and left the valley black and bare and silent. What little grain the families had was mortgaged to gantry or already sold down to the railroad, and there was not a bushel of bread nor a peck of sound seed to be had in the whole country at any price, and the winter coming on. And every proud, soft wheat man who had chuckled at the fool's tower on the rise stood in a stripped black field, with nothing standing and nothing saved, and his ground bound to a grain buyer's book. And then Marta Osterhout threw open the door of her mocked little mill on the windy rise. The whole anxious valley drove up to the rise the day she opened it. A good part of them come half-meaning to see the mill girl found out, with Orville Gantry among them and Leland Coyle driven over in his fine rig to watch the finish. And they found they had come to the wrong day. They crowded up to a mill that stood plumb and turning sweet in the wind, and a granary that stood dry and close to the plates with bin on bin of sound grain. And out of it Marta and Cyrus drew the hard old country wheat threshed, a whole season gone, and every bin came open sweet and dry and clean, the windmill grinding it fine and dark and true, and the first loaves out of Hesse Aldous' oven come up close and brown and good, bread a family could live a hard winter on. One after another the neighbors tasted the warm, dark bread and knew it for honest. The drovers and the few farms still solvent paid down good coin on the meal chest for all to see, the very trade Coyle had sworn would never come, and the stripped-out families Marta carried, grinding their little saved handfuls for nothing, and giving out sound seed wheat for the spring from the bins Cyrus had cribbed, asking only their fair turn at the stones and a bushel back at the next. Harvest, and the families who had trusted her, old Barnaby Aldous first among them, went home with meal for their bread and seed for their ground and their debts unswollen, and stood free of Gantry's book. The grain that would sicken had fed them, the mill that would lean over stood turning in the wind, and the seed that no one would sow was carrying the whole valley into the spring. And there was no more to be said. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. Marta only stood by her open mill door and let the valley taste her honest bread and see which of them had told the truth, and watched the color drain out of Leland Coyle's face as the good coin came down on grain he had sworn was filth. She spoke no cruel word to any of them. And before the murmuring had well settled, Cyrus stepped up beside her, hat in his scarred hands, and said, low but plain, that he had done no more than trew a frame and hang a stone, and that the mill and the grain and the craft and the keeping of it were hers by right, and no grain buyer's book could touch them, and the sound sweet meal in the neighbors' sacks said the same. So the reckoning went the other way that year. The families of Harrow Bend fed their households through the grasshopper winter, and sowed Marta's sound seed in the spring and kept their ground, and Marta settled her own reckoning with Orville Gantry to the last cent, and owed him nothing, and he took it with his face gone stiff, and his easy talk of carrying her on the book put clean away. Leland Coyle drove back to his company, having reached for a trade that was never his to hold, and a lie that would not keep, and the company sent no more of him up the valley before the spring. And the good dark bread went on coming out of Marta's mill every harvest after, and her mother's hand-quern went on grinding the first sweet handful of every new wheat in her hand. Cyrus had stood at her shoulder through the whole of it, and when it was over he turned to face her plainly where any who cared to could see. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said, low, but not so low that Hesse Aldous a step away could not hear it and gladly tell it after, that he had promised himself in the fall to see her mill turning and her ground safe, and then follow the Wrights' trade on west to the railroad towns and trouble her no more, and that he had found he was a liar, for he had no wish to trew a frame or hang a stone on any bench that had not. The sound of her mill and her stones somewhere near it. The secret of the winter bins had been his own doing, he said, and he was gladder than he could say that his own long nights had made her grain keep sound. And Marta looked at the silent man who had spent a whole season's rest at his bench in the dark to make a clean thing prove itself, and she did not make him ask her twice. They were married in the first green of the next spring, in the little house Cyrus raised beside the mill. The Alduses in the front room, and the morning sun coming clean through the window he had glazed with his own hands. And when the wedding folk had gone, Marta took her mother's hand quern down from the mill-sill and set it on the fine bracket Cyrus had made for it beside the mill door, where the low gold light of a summer evening would find the worn-round stones and warm them, so the old careful craft that a soft wheat man's say-so could not kill would go on in that country in her hand all her days. She ground the first handful of every harvest on it beside the quiet man who had put his own long season against the whole valley to make her mill turn. And the wives who had once pitied her sent up the rise to her mill for their good dark bread, and were glad to. A doubt, it turns out, is the smallest measure of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a valley can do is decide who a body is before it has troubled to know them. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low, when the whole world has already made up its mind that you will fail, and handed you nothing but its pity and a poor woman's notion to do it with, do you let their doubting and your own hard pride drive you back the way you came, or do you trust the one quiet soul who will build beside you through the hard season and stand with you into the easy one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.